August 17, 1987, 180 feet below the Caribbean surface, where sunlight surrenders to darkness, a team of deep-sea salvage divers made a discovery that would reopen one of the most haunting mysteries in maritime history. The wreck had been there for decades, a forgotten tomb of twisted metal and decay, its secrets buried beneath layers of coral and time. The water at that depth pressed against them with crushing weight, each breath from their regulators a reminder of how far they were from the world above. Their powerful underwater lights cut through the murky darkness, illuminating clouds of sediment that danced like ghosts in the current. Then, in a chamber that appeared to have once been a cargo hold, they saw it. An ancient trunk, its wood black with rot and marine growth, stood open as if waiting. Around it, deteriorated fabrics lay scattered across the ocean floor like funeral shrouds, barely recognizable as what they once were. A thin veil of mist seemed to hang in the water itself, particles catching the light in an almost supernatural display. And there, resting among the ruins and ruin, gleaming as if untouched by the 28 years that had passed, was a necklace. Not just any necklace. Emeralds, Colombian emeralds, each stone perfectly cut and aligned in sequence, leading to a center stone so large, so impossibly brilliant, that even at 180 feet below the surface, even through decades of ocean water, it seemed to pulse with an inner fire. The green was so vivid it looked like bottled light, a piece of impossible beauty in a grave of decay. One of the divers reached out with a gloved hand, his movements slow in the dense water. As he lifted the necklace, the emeralds caught the beam of his light, and for a moment the entire chamber seemed to illuminate with that otherworldly green glow. They had no idea whose necklace it was, not yet. But when they surfaced and photographs were compared against old records, when experts were called in and families were contacted, the truth emerged like something from a nightmare. This was the Mitchell Emerald Necklace, the one that had vanished with Ashley Mitchell on a moonlit night in March 1959. The one that had disappeared without a trace, along with the beautiful young woman who had been wearing it. Before we dive deeper into this mystery, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened on PDT, that cruise in 1959, involves secrets that sink deeper than the ocean floor. A truth so disturbing it stayed hidden for nearly 3 decades. And by the end, you'll understand why some mysteries refuse to be solved. The question that haunted investigators then and continues to haunt us now is devastatingly simple. How did Ashley Mitchell's necklace end up in a shipwreck 180 feet below the surface when she disappeared from a luxury cruise ship that never sank? What happened on that ship in 1959? And more terrifying still, where is Ashley Mitchell? To understand the magnitude of what was lost that night, you need to understand who Ashley Mitchell was. Not the headlines, not the Society page photographs, the real woman behind the pearls and champagne smiles. Ashley Mitchell was 27 years old in the spring of 1959, though people who knew her said she possessed a presence that made her seem both older and younger at the same time. Older in her poise, her grace, the way she could command a room simply by entering it. Younger in her laugh, which was described by her friends as infectious and completely without pretense, the kind of laugh that made everyone around her want to laugh too. She stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, which was considered quite tall for a woman in that era, and she carried herself with the kind of posture that suggested years of department classes and cotillion balls. Her hair was platinum blonde, not from a bottle, but natural, the kind of pale gold that seemed to catch light even in dim rooms. She wore it in the style of the time, perfectly coiffed in soft waves that framed her face. Though her younger sister would later tell investigators that Ashley's favorite moments were when she could let it down, when she could run her fingers through it and let it fall naturally around her shoulders.
Her eyes were what people remembered most, a striking blue, the color of the Caribbean waters she would eventually disappear into, fringed with naturally dark lashes that needed no mascara. But it wasn't just the color, it was the way she looked at people. Her cousin would later say, Ashley had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the world when she spoke to you. She'd look right into your eyes, and you knew she was actually listening, actually caring about what you had to say. She had a small beauty mark just above the left corner of her mouth, which she never tried to hide. In an era when such marks were considered flaws, Ashley wore hers like a signature. Her smile was wide and genuine, revealing perfectly straight white teeth, and she smiled often, perhaps too often, some would later speculate. Perhaps she smiled to hide things no one was supposed to see. Ashley was born into wealth, the kind of old money that came from Texas oil fields and shrewd investments made generations before. Her father, Robert Mitchell Sr., had expanded the family fortune into shipping and real estate. The family maintained homes in Houston, Palm Beach, and Manhattan. But Ashley herself was never ostentatious about the money. Yes, she wore designer dresses and owned jewelry that could fund small countries, but those who knew her said she was far more likely to be found in simple slacks and a cotton blouse, her feet bare, reading a book in the garden of their Palm Beach estate. She loved literature, particularly the romantic poets Byron, Shelley, Keats. Her bedroom, which investigators would later photograph, contained over 200 books, many of them annotated in her neat handwriting. She loved music, too, everything from classical to the new rock and roll that was scandalizing parents across America. She could play piano beautifully, though she always insisted she wasn't very good. Her mother would later tell police that some of her fondest memories were hearing Ashley play Chopin nocturnes in the evening, the music drifting through their Palm Beach home like a ghost. But perhaps what defined Ashley most was her genuine kindness. This wasn't the performative charity of the wealthy, the writing of checks to feel good about oneself. Ashley volunteered at a children's hospital in Palm Beach every Thursday afternoon, reading to kids who were too sick to go to school. She knew all their names, their favorite stories, their fears and dreams. She sent them cards on their birthdays. When one young boy needed an experimental treatment the family couldn't afford, Ashley quietly paid for it. The family only found out after the boy recovered. Her daily routine was one of comfortable privilege, but also genuine purpose. She'd wake at 7 a.m., have coffee while reading the newspaper, then spend the morning either at the hospital or working with the various charitable organizations she supported. Lunch was usually with friends at the beach club, though she preferred the smaller, quieter tables away from the main dining room. Afternoons might be spent shopping or sailing or simply lying by the pool with a book. Evenings were for social events, charity galas, dinner parties. She was a fixture of Palm Beach society, but she never seemed to take it too seriously. And then there was Richard Mitchell. They'd met at a New Year's Eve party in 1958, just 3 months before the cruise. Richard was 31, handsome in that clean-cut, all-American way that was popular in the late 1950s. He worked in his own family's banking business in Boston, though he'd been spending more time in Florida, ostensibly for business, but really, as friends later said, to pursue Ashley. The courtship was a whirlwind, the kind of romance that made the society pages swoon. Flowers delivered daily, weekend trips to New York, dancing under the stars at the Breakers Hotel. Richard proposed on Valentine's Day in 1959, presenting her with a 5-carat diamond ring at sunset on Worth Avenue. She said yes immediately, according to witnesses, throwing her arms around him with a joy that seemed almost childlike. They married on March 7, 1959, in a small ceremony at the Episcopal Church in Palm Beach, just family and close friends. Ashley wore a simple white silk gown, and around her neck the emerald necklace that would become her signature and eventually her mystery. The necklace had been her grandmother's, a gift from Ashley's grandfather after a successful business deal in Colombia in the 1920s. 7 perfect Colombian emeralds, each one carefully selected, with a center stone that weighed nearly 15 carats. The green was so vivid it looked like bottled light, a piece of impossible beauty in a grave of decay. One of the divers reached out with a gloved hand, his movements slow in the dense water. As he lifted the necklace, the emeralds caught the beam of his light, and for a moment the entire chamber seemed to illuminate with that otherworldly green glow. They had no idea whose necklace it was, not yet, but when they surfaced and photographs were compared against old records, when experts were called in and families were contacted, the truth emerged like something from a nightmare. This was the Mitchell Emerald Necklace, the one that had vanished with Ashley Mitchell on a moonlit night in March 1959, the one that had disappeared without a trace along with the beautiful young woman who had been wearing it. Before we dive deeper into this mystery, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened on PDT, that cruise in 1950?
Light blue robe, her hair down around her shoulders. Richard answered the door in slacks and a white undershirt. They thanked him, tipped generously, and the steward left them alone. They spent the morning on the pool deck. Several passengers would later remember seeing them, Ashley in a red one-piece swimsuit that showed off her slender figure, Richard in navy swim trunks. They swam, they sunbathed, they read magazines side by side on white lounge chairs. A photographer who was capturing candid shots of passengers for the ship's daily bulletin took several pictures of them. In those photographs, Ashley is smiling, her wet hair slicked back from her face, her hand resting on Richard's arm. They looked like what they were supposed to be, newlyweds in paradise. Lunch was at the Starlight Cafe at 12:45 p.m. They sat with another couple they'd befriended on the cruise, Thomas and Dorothy Hayes from Atlanta. The four of them shared a table near the windows, overlooking the endless blue of the Caribbean. The conversation was light, Dorothy would later recall. They talked about the islands they would visit, about plans for when they returned home, about mundane, happy things. Ashley ordered the chef's salad and iced tea. She ate most of her meal. She seemed perfectly normal, perfectly content. The afternoon was spent in their suite. The weather had turned slightly warm, and they wanted to rest before the evening's festivities. The ship was hosting a formal captain's gala that night, one of the highlights of any Caribbean Star cruise. Passengers were expected to dress in their finest. For Ashley, that meant one very specific piece of jewelry. At 6 p.m., Richard left the suite to get ice from the machine down the corridor. When he returned 3 minutes later, Ashley was in the bathroom, already starting to prepare for the evening. He could hear the shower running, could see steam escaping from under the door. He mixed himself a bourbon and water, sat on the edge of the bed, and waited. Ashley emerged at 6:35 p.m. in a white terry cloth robe, her hair wrapped in a towel. She sat at the vanity and began the careful process of applying makeup, styling her hair. Richard showered and dressed in his tuxedo. By 7:15 p.m., they were both nearly ready, and then Ashley opened the suite safe and removed the emerald necklace. She'd worn it twice before on the cruise, but tonight she told Richard she wanted to wear something special. The gala was formal, elegant, and the necklace deserved to be seen. She fastened it around her neck, the green stones catching the light from the vanity bulbs, and she turned to show Richard. He would later tell investigators that she looked more beautiful than he'd ever seen her, that the emeralds seemed to make her blue eyes even more striking. At 7:30 p.m., Ashley and Richard Mitchell left their suite and made their way to the grand ballroom. She was wearing a floor-length black velvet gown with a sweetheart neckline that perfectly displayed the emerald necklace. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, showing off the graceful line of her neck. She wore long white gloves that reached past her elbows. She looked, according to multiple witnesses, like something from a Hollywood movie. The captain's gala was everything it promised to be. The grand ballroom had been decorated with white roses and gold ribbons. A live orchestra played big band music. Champagne flowed freely.
The captain himself, Malcolm Hendris, welcomed the passengers and gave a short speech about the proud tradition of the Caribbean Star. Ashley and Richard sat at a table with the Hayes couple and two other pairs they'd met during the cruise. Dinner was served at 8 p.m. Lobster thermidor, filet mignon, roasted vegetables, and a chocolate soufflé for dessert. Multiple witnesses would later confirm that Ashley seemed to be enjoying herself immensely. She danced with Richard 3 times, she laughed at jokes, she complimented Dorothy Hayes on her dress. She ate her dinner, though not all of it, leaving most of the filet mignon untouched. She drank 2 glasses of champagne over the course of the evening. She showed no signs of distress, no indication that anything was wrong. At 10:25 p.m., Ashley excused herself to use the powder room. She returned 7 minutes later, reapplying lipstick as she walked. At 10:45 p.m., she and Richard danced to Moonlight Serenade, her head resting on his shoulder, the emerald necklace gleaming under the eye ballroom lights. At 11:20 p.m., Ashley told Richard she was feeling slightly tired and wanted some fresh air. He offered to accompany her, but she smiled and said she'd just be a few minutes, that she wanted to walk alone and clear her head. He kissed her cheek and let her go. Security footage would later show Ashley Mitchell leaving the Grand Ballroom at exactly 11:22 p.m. She walked through the main corridor, nodding to a steward who passed her going the opposite direction. She took the stairs to the observation deck, emerging into the warm Caribbean night at 11:24 p.m. The observation deck was a popular spot during the day, but at night it was usually deserted. Located at the rear of the ship, it offered unobstructed views of the wake and the stars. There were no security cameras on the deck itself, a detail that would prove catastrophically important later. The only light came from a few dim fixtures along the railings and the glow of the moon, which was nearly full that night. At 11:45 p.m., a crew member named James Foster, a 28-year-old assistant engineer, went to the observation deck to smoke a cigarette during his break. He would later testify that he saw a woman standing alone at the far railing, looking out at the water. She was wearing a dark dress and had blonde hair. He couldn't see her face clearly, but the description matched Ashley Mitchell perfectly. He smoked his cigarette, stubbed it out in an ashtray, and returned to his duties at 11:52 p.m. The woman was still standing at the railing when he left. That was the last confirmed sighting of Ashley Mitchell. Richard waited in the Grand Ballroom until midnight, then began to worry. Ashley had been gone for 40 minutes, longer than she'd intended. He went looking for her, checking the powder room first, then walking through the main corridors, asking crew members if they'd seen a woman in a black velvet dress with an emerald necklace. No one had, not recently. Growing more concerned, he went to their suite, thinking perhaps she'd returned there and fallen asleep. The suite was empty. Her black velvet evening bag was on the bed, but Ashley was nowhere to be found. At 12:25 a.m., Richard Mitchell reported his wife missing to the ship's security. By 12:40 a.m., a full search of the Caribbean Star was underway. The conditions that night were nearly perfect for visibility. The sea was calm, with swells of only 2 to 3 feet. The moon was bright enough to read with. The ship's powerful searchlights swept the water in every direction, looking for any sign of a person overboard. Every deck was searched, every public room, every storage area, every inch of the ship where a person could possibly be. Ashley's name was called over the ship's intercom repeatedly. Crew members knocked on every cabin door, asking if anyone had seen her. By 3 a.m., it was clear that Ashley Mitchell was not on the Caribbean Star. She had somehow, impossibly vanished. At 3:15 a.m. on March 16, 1959, Captain Malcolm Hendris made the decision that would define the rest of his career. He ordered the Caribbean Star to stop, to hold position in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, and he radioed the United States Coast Guard. A passenger was missing, presumed overboard. They needed help immediately. The Coast Guard responded with impressive speed. By 4:30 a.m., 2 helicopters and 3 patrol boats were en route to the Caribbean Star's coordinates. By sunrise at 6:42 a.m., a full maritime search and rescue operation was underway. Boats circled in an expanding spiral pattern from the ship's last known position. Helicopters flew low over the water, their crews scanning for any sign of a person. The search radius was calculated based on current, wind speed, and the time Ashley had been missing. It covered approximately 150 square miles of ocean. They found nothing. No body, no debris, no sign that Ashley Mitchell had ever entered the water. On board the Caribbean Star, chaos reigned. Passengers who'd been sleeping were woken by the commotion, by the searchlights and the sound of helicopters overhead. Word spread quickly. The beautiful blonde woman with the emerald necklace had vanished during the night. Some passengers packed their bags, demanding to be taken back to Miami immediately. Others gathered in small groups, whispering theories, each one more outlandish than the last. Richard Mitchell was questioned extensively by both ship security and, once they arrived, by helicopter, FBI agents who specialized in maritime incidents. The questioning took place in the captain's private office. Richard was devastated, barely able to speak coherently. He kept saying, "I should have gone with her. I should have walked her to the deck. This is my fault." The agents noted that his distress seemed genuine, that there were no signs of deception in his body language or his answers. His hands shook. His eyes were red from crying. He'd loved his wife, that much was clear. But they had to ask the difficult questions anyway. Had they been fighting? No, never, Richard insisted. They'd been happy, truly happy. Had Ashley seemed depressed?
After that, nothing. It was as if she'd simply ceased to exist. Several passengers came forward with information that initially seemed promising but ultimately led nowhere. An elderly woman claimed to have heard a scream around midnight, but she couldn't say where it had come from, and no one else reported hearing anything unusual. A man said he'd seen 2 figures struggling near the railing of the observation deck, but when pressed for details, he admitted his eyesight was poor and he couldn't be certain what he'd actually seen. A teenager swore she'd seen Ashley in the corridor near the suites at 1 a.m., but the timeline made that impossible, and the girl eventually admitted she might have been mistaken. The ship's crew came under particular scrutiny. In 1959, maritime law enforcement was not as sophisticated as it would later become, but the FBI agents were thorough. They checked every crew member's background, looking for criminal records, suspicious behavior, any reason someone might have harmed Ashley Mitchell. They found nothing significant. A few crew members had minor offenses in their past, nothing violent, nothing that suggested they were capable of murder or kidnapping. The theory that began to take hold, simply because no other explanation fit the facts, was that Ashley had accidentally fallen overboard. Perhaps she'd been standing at the railing, leaning out to look at the water, and she'd lost her balance. The railing on the observation deck was 42 inches high, tall enough to be safe under normal circumstances, but not impossible to topple over if someone leaned too far. It was the only explanation that made sense, even though it raised its own terrible questions. Why hadn't she screamed? Why hadn't anyone heard a splash? And why, if she'd fallen into calm seas under a bright moon, hadn't the Coast Guard found her body? Ashley's family arrived in Miami on March 17th, having been flown in from Texas on a private plane. Her mother, Catherine Mitchell, was barely functional with grief. Her father, Robert Sr., was stoic, but clearly shattered. Her younger sister, Caroline, just 22 years old, couldn't stop crying. They held a press conference at the urging of the FBI, hoping that publicity might generate new leads. The photographs from that press conference are heartbreaking. Catherine Mitchell, wearing dark glasses to hide her tears, clutching a photo of Ashley from the wedding. Robert Sr., his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the podium. Caroline, her face a mask of anguish.
"If anyone knows anything," Catherine Mitchell said, her voice breaking, "if anyone saw anything, please, please come forward. Ashley is our daughter, our sister, our friend. She doesn't deserve this. We need to bring her home." But no one came forward with information that changed anything. The Coast Guard search was officially called off on March 20th, 5 days after Ashley's disappearance. The statistical probability of finding a survivor after that much time, especially with no evidence of where she'd entered the water, was essentially zero. The Caribbean Star was released to continue its voyage, though the cruise was effectively ruined. Most passengers disembarked in Miami as soon as the ship docked on March 22nd, wanting nothing more than to be on solid ground again. The FBI investigation continued for another 6 weeks, but without new evidence, there was nowhere for it to go. On May 2, 1959, the case was officially classified as death by misadventure, presumed accidental drowning. There was no body to bury, no closure for the family, just an empty coffin at a memorial service in Palm Beach, attended by over 400 people, all of them mourning a woman who'd simply vanished into the night. Richard Mitchell never fully recovered. He returned to Boston but couldn't focus on work. Friends said he aged 10 years in a matter of months. He never removed his wedding ring. He kept Ashley's photograph on his desk, another in his wallet, another on his bedside table. He funded a scholarship in her name at the Children's Hospital where she'd volunteered. He never dated, never remarried. When people asked him why, he'd say simply, "I'm still married. My wife is just missing." The Mitchell family hired private investigators, offered rewards totaling $50,000 for information, placed ads in newspapers across the country. Nothing came of it. Ashley Mitchell had disappeared as completely as if she'd never existed, leaving behind only memories, grief, and one final haunting question: what had really happened on that observation deck on the night of March 15, 1959? The answer to that question would remain hidden for 27 years, buried in the darkness of the Caribbean Sea, waiting in a shipwreck 180 feet below the surface, guarded by an emerald necklace that refused to stop shining. The years following Ashley Mitchell's disappearance were marked by a peculiar kind of limbo, a suspended grief that never quite resolved because there was never quite proof that she was dead. For the Mitchell family, time didn't heal, it just stretched the wound wider. Catherine Mitchell, Ashley's mother, became obsessed with the case in a way that worried her family and friends. She kept Ashley's room in their Palm Beach home exactly as it had been the day Ashley left for her honeymoon. The books on the shelves, the clothes in the closet, the photographs on the dresser, all preserved like a shrine. She spent hours in that room, sitting on Ashley's bed, reading Ashley's annotated poetry books, trying to understand something that had no understanding. Every year on March 15th, Catherine would place an ad in the Miami Herald. "Ashley, if you're out there, please come home. We love you. We're waiting. Mom." It was irrational, everyone knew that. If Ashley were alive, if she somehow survived or run away, she would have contacted them. But grief is not rational, and hope dies harder than we like to admit. Robert Mitchell Sr. took a different approach. He turned his grief into action, channeling his pain into a crusade for improved maritime safety. He lobbied Congress for stricter regulations on cruise ships, for better monitoring systems, for mandatory security cameras on all observation decks. Some of his proposals were adopted, others weren't. It didn't matter to him. He needed to feel like he was doing something, needed to believe that his daughter's death could prevent other deaths. Caroline, Ashley's younger sister, perhaps suffered the most in her own way. She'd been 22 years old when Ashley disappeared, on the cusp of her own adult life, planning her own wedding. After Ashley vanished, Caroline called off the engagement. She couldn't bear the thought of happiness when her sister might be at the bottom of the ocean. She moved back home to Palm Beach, helping her mother cope, watching her father wage his legislative battles, trying to hold a family together that was missing its brightest piece. Richard Mitchell's story took a darker turn. He tried to return to normal life, tried to work at the bank, tried to exist in a world where his wife had simply evaporated. but the whispers followed him everywhere. People wondered, as people always do, had he killed her? Had there been a fight on that observation deck? Had he pushed her over the railing and then played the grieving husband? The FBI had cleared him, yes, but the court of public opinion is not bound by evidence. By 1962, 3 years after Ashley's disappearance, Richard had left Boston. He couldn't stand the looks anymore, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room, the way old friends avoided him at social events. He moved to California, to a small town north of San Francisco, where nobody knew his story. He got a job at a local bank under his middle name. He lived alone in a rented cottage overlooking the Pacific Ocean. People who knew him there said he'd walk the beach for hours every evening, staring out at the water as if it might finally give him an answer. Meanwhile, the story of Ashley Mitchell's disappearance had taken on a life of its own. In 1961, a pulp magazine published a sensationalized account titled "The Socialite Who Vanished at Sea: What Really Happened." It was full of speculation and invented details, suggesting everything from a love triangle gone wrong to a mafia hit disguised as an accident. The Mitchell family sued for libel and won a small settlement, but the damage was done. The case had become tabloid fodder. In 1965, a woman in San Diego contacted police claiming to be Ashley Mitchell, saying she'd survived but had amnesia and was only now remembering her identity. The woman looked nothing like Ashley, had a completely different background that was easily verified, and appeared to be suffering from delusional disorder. She was hospitalized for psychiatric treatment, but the incident renewed media interest in the case, and for several weeks, the Mitchell family endured another round of painful publicity. There were other false sightings over the years. A blonde woman spotted in Mexico City in 1967 who resembled Ashley, a woman matching her description allegedly boarding a ferry in Greece in 1970. Each time, the Mitchell family's hopes would rise and then crash. Each time, the investigation led nowhere. It was torture, this endless cycle of maybe, this refusal of the universe to provide certainty. The maritime community, particularly those who worked on cruise ships, developed their own theories about what had happened. Some crew members who'd been on the Caribbean Star that night later came forward with suspicions they hadn't voiced during the initial investigation. One steward suggested that Ashley might have been drunk, more drunk than the 2 glasses of champagne suggested, and fallen over the railing in an impaired state. But toxicology reports couldn't be run without a body, so this remained pure speculation. Others in the maritime world whispered about more sinister possibilities. There were rumors, never substantiated, of a crew member who'd been fired shortly after the incident, who'd left the country, who might have had something to do with Ashley's disappearance. The FBI followed up on these leads, tracked the man down in Venezuela,